to do that, like following through at home, if they're part of making the plan and they're invested into it and they're part of the relationship from the beginning, then you're doing it together.
Okay.
Versus like, you need to do this at home. Do you see that difference?
Yeah.
Of that feeling? I was part of a program once where, I mean, there was a lot of expectation on the parent on things that they had to do at home, and it was pretty hot, pretty big. Like, they had to do a lot of things at home to follow through when the challenging behavior was happening at home to be consistent with what was happening at school, and it was really a wrong approach. It was instead of, so when he screams, I'm not making a good example, let me think. You know, when he screams and yells, you know, you need to ignore him, and when he stops, then he gets his dessert. And it's a really bad example, but it put a lot of pressure on the parent on how they needed to respond at home, and then paralleling however he was being responded at school. So we were responding to the behavior, and we were telling the parent what to do during the behavior, but what we weren't doing was figuring out together how to teach him something new. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Or any other ones that jump out?
Well, I think let parents believe the child needs more discipline. I think I've found when I have these conversations with parents, sometimes that's what the parent jumps to
Oh, yeah, there's another one.
before, you know, like, you're not necessarily saying, like, you need to do something better, but sometimes I feel like the parents jump there first, like, okay,
Right.
well, what do you want me to do? Like, should I put her in timeout?
Right.
Should I put her in timeout every time she does that?
And the word, yeah.
You know, and so, like, reminding them that, like, that's not going to be the answer that you look for at school, and it might not be what they should do at home either.
Right. And that's when you really start talking about best practices. You know, and those evidence-based practices that like we learned through implementing pyramid is the idea of, you know, discipline gets you into thinking like punishment, and it gets into that negative feeling. And instead, it's funny, just wrote your policies about this, looking more at guidance and offering guidance, and taking the word discipline into the concept of guidance, and then again, going back to the idea of like helping them to learn the skill. So taking out all that negative feeling, I feel like that feeling, energy, stuff, no, just kidding. And, you know, reframing parents' minds. And I think that's huge, Chelsea, because, you know, a lot of parents don't know this stuff. And so like that's up to us to how do we provide them those resources to change their frame of mind, you know, to get away from the timeouts, to get away from the yelling, to get away from the threats, and, you know, all those things are all considered red flags of practices, and helping to guide them into a different perspective, you know, and not putting it on them. It's like, again, that team. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Anything else? Cool. So we're going to talk a little bit about the conversation skills, and I want to give you guys a chance to, well, I'll let you decide, because I want you to practice, but then if you have questions and discussion, and be mindful of your time. So a lot of this we talked about already a little, well, maybe not. Anyway, one thing is that practicing that acknowledge, ask, and adapt. So that's on the next page. So really, when you're having that conversation, especially those open-ended questions, you know, like, well, what are you seeing at home? You know, and thinking, it's really good to actually have open-ended questions in your back pocket, because you have those conversations with parents where they're not participating. So, you know, thinking of some creative ways to like have some open-ended questions in your back pocket to help engage families, because some families are really quiet. You know, some cultures, you know, the language different, like there's so many things to think about. But anyway, so really recognizing, you know, what their thoughts are, and this was more in the conflict resolution, but I think it still works really well for this, is thinking, acknowledging what the family's saying, repeating back what they're saying, repeating back what their perspective is, really showing that you're hearing them. That's huge. You know, asking questions, asking more questions to to better understand them and their perspective. Ask them what they're doing at home, ask them what they see, get those details. You know, again, when we were talking about the behavior, instead of saying, you know, oh, he gets so crazy and everyone gets annoyed, versus, well, what does that really look like? Oh, he pulls his hair, he kicks. So like getting some clarifying questions. Does that make sense? And then seeing, you know, that adapting. Like, so you guys are in this dance, in this conversation, coming to a plan together where you have the common goal. You have the agenda and a plan in place and next steps in place. Does that come back? Is that coming back to you? And then that stop, observe, understand, and listen, or maybe use AL, adopt, wait, and adopt. Observe, wait, and listen. Right? So thinking about, you know, when you ask those questions and those awkward silences, because of course you're nervous. Well, maybe you're not. I mean, I still get nervous when I have conversations with parents, like important things, like that empty, quiet space we want to fill up because it's so uncomfortable, right? It's really awkward. Well, let it be. Because that family might need time to think and articulate and respond, maybe even more than our kids do. So really making sure you're putting that wait time in is super duper important. Focusing on working together, focusing on the developing of a new skill. You know, I've talked a lot about that already. You know, the parent asks a question and you don't know the answer, it's okay. It's okay. Instead of making something up or trying to find something that's going to satisfy them, because I've done that too, you know, being like, it was like one of the greatest tricks somebody taught me once, as when I was a director, was, you know, you can say, I'm not sure, let me get back to you on that. You know, let me like gather some resources, let me go ask somebody, let me think about it. Sometimes people ask me questions on the spot, you know, and like when you guys ask me questions, you know, just I have a moment and I'm all scattered and think about it. And it's okay to say, let me get back to you on that, because we don't know everything. Don't point fingers, I talked a lot about that already. Describe the behavior instead of diagnosing. Our jobs, we're not qualified to diagnose. So we're not even supposed to say to a parent by law that your child has the chicken pox, unless you're a doctor. Remember that in the healthy rules? But yeah, like our job's not to diagnose. We can describe and talk about skills and behaviors and needs and give resources, but we don't diagnose. So that's really important. Even saying like, oh, he has sensory issues, because that's like a buzzword, that's a big one, but that's not up to us to say that. You can say, I notice that he doesn't like to put shirts and shoes on, or when it gets really loud, he covers his ears. You can describe it, but you can't label it. You see the difference? And then thinking about the barriers, like the needs of the family, like the special needs of the family, the needs of the child. You know, so let's talk about that a little bit. When you're having conversations with families, you're having this conversation, what are some things that could come up that you need to think about when you're thinking about families, cultures, kiddos with special needs, things like that?
We have a family who was going to seek services, but they say child find is closed for the summer. Okay, then they must be making something up. And I said that, I was like, I don't think that's true, but I'm like, I'm not the point person, so I'm hearing everything secondhand. But I think that they're just like not wanting to do that. Yeah.
So thinking about families that, you know, the children are having some developmental delays and you're trying to find some outside resources, and maybe you have a family that's in denial or they're a little reluctant, which is a lot of what this conversation's about, and like having those resources available to families, it's like, oh, I could check on that and get back to you, you know. And thinking about what kind of need do you think the child has?
A lot.
A lot here?
No.
You know me, I'm like,
I know. He doesn't really.
so that's really hard because in other in your program, ideally, you know, you think about kiddos with special needs and identifying or, you know, supporting families through that process. You know, how do you have something in place in your program to help recognize those along right away and to help work with families right away as a team towards that, so it's not big and scary and threatening and
And again,
And
it's
out
hard
of the
because
blue.
it's not my job to
Yeah.
be like the point person with the family, so I'm like, you know, nudging
yeah,
people left and right, but
yeah.
I don't know.
We can talk more about that
Yeah.
because I really want to support you guys through that. What were you gonna say, Chelsea?
Yeah, well, I guess I was thinking two different things. Like, I think also when you're thinking about like, having these challenging conversations, this doesn't come up in this training, but it's something we've talked about in the past. So like the importance of having someone else there.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up.
2 sets of ears.
2 sets of ears. I think it's really huge when you have when you're having difficult conversations with parents for many reasons to protect yourself and the family and have an extra set of ears and like a unbiased perspective and maybe someone who has some more input as well. Be part of these conversations because there's a lot. The positives is you have more than one set of ears. You have someone taking notes. The pressure's off the 2 people, like having to be, you know, it's more of a team environment. And then like worst case scenario is if the family doesn't receive the information well and they hear it in a certain way, you know, it could backfire at you. Like, oh, Chelsea said that my kid is the worst and that he needs to be sent to boarding school. And like Chelsea's like, oh my God, I never would even say such a thing.
Yeah.
So it is really important. I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. And that's a good practice for directors with hard conversations with staff members. Because it can backfire at you. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'm thinking about really fast, too, because I want to be mindful of your time. Think about, you know, families that are English language learners or, you know, English is not their first language. So some strategies around that, like how are you going to make sure the family has an understanding of what we're talking about? So do you have any ideas around that?
You could ask for an interpreter or someone that
Mhm.
knows their language to sit in with you so that you're sure to understand each concept.
Yeah, asking for an interpreter to come, checking for understanding, that was great. What else?
I think like being flexible and, you know, making sure that they're feeling comfortable and not like pressured about maybe not knowing the language as well or something.
I also think about like providing visuals, you know, maybe whatever you're talking about, maybe you have visuals around it, you know, or ideas moving forward, you have some visuals with it. Providing like an outline in a document, maybe translated, I think the Google Translate or something like that.
Yeah.
A good resource that I didn't know about, so I started working there, is the Speech, Language, and Hearing Center on CU campus. Actually has a lot of access to different like interpreters and bilingual of all sorts. And so, and a lot of times they're graduate students, so they might need they might need extra stuff or, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there on CU campus in general too. Thinking also about families, you know, you might have to do these kind of conversations really early in the morning, you know, or really after school someday. So thinking about, you know, there is that extra time that comes off of our free time, but the investment's always worth it. But we might have to work around family schedules, and that could be a barrier. Or thinking about if there's 2 separate homes, that could be something you need to think about too. Does that make sense? So it is 2:30, believe it or not. Is that clock right?
Yeah.
Yep.
2:32. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up. We're going to skip the activity, and then if you want to stay, you have questions or things coming up in your lives of conferences you want to talk about. I thought this was cute. The reason they can play that good is their parents aren't yelling at them from the sidelines. Isn't that funny? So the major message today is that